In early 1932, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg fixated on a question most people avoided. What, exactly, made a human child develop into a human adult? He worked in a time when scientists argued about nature versus nurture, but evidence felt thin and indirect. Kellogg wanted something cleaner, one home, one set of rules, two young lives growing at the same pace. He believed that would expose the difference. He did not look for answers in classrooms or clinics. He aimed straight at the family. Kellogg became convinced that the only fair test was to remove excuses and keep the environment identical. Same care, same attention, same daily routine. The plan sounded simple, almost practical, and that simplicity made it dangerous because it treated development like a switch you could flip, and it treated living beings like instruments. Kellogg settled on a method that crossed a line even for his era. He planned to raise a human infant alongside a young chimpanzee under one roof. He expected the comparison to reveal what learning could change and what biology refused to change. He also expected control, as if a home could become a lab without resistance. But the moment he committed to that setup, the experiment stopped being theoretical. It became a household reality. Kellogg did not keep the next step at a distance. He brought a 7.5-month-old chimpanzee into his Florida home and made her part of the household. Her name was Gua, and she arrived at an age where she still depended on constant care. In the same house lived his 10-month-old son, Donald. From the start, Kellogg treated their ages like a starting line. Gua was not presented as a pet or a visiting animal. She was introduced as a sister. That single label mattered because it changed what everyone was expected to do. Gua belonged at the table, in the daily routines, and in the close contact usually reserved for a child. Kellogg's family life stopped being private. It became the setting for a controlled experiment. With Gua and Donald placed side by side, Kellogg set up a situation that could not be undone. Every shared moment now carried two meanings at once: normal care and measured comparison. The babies would grow, learn, and react in real time, under the same roof, under the same attention. He did not just observe development, he staged it inside his own family. The experiment stopped feeling like an unusual family arrangement and started running like a schedule. Meals happened together, measured and compared. Baths became another controlled moment, watched for who resisted, who relaxed, who learned faster. Playtime no longer counted as free time. It turned into a repeated test, the same toys, the same prompts, the same expectations. Side by side, Gua and Donald were no longer just growing up, they were being monitored. Kellogg recorded everything as data, not impressions. He tracked how each one held a spoon, followed a gesture, reacted to a sound, or reached for an object. Small differences mattered because he treated them like clues about what was learned and what was inborn. If Donald cried sooner, that went down. If Gua solved a task without hesitation, that went down too. Day after day, ordinary behavior became evidence. Nothing stayed casual. The comparisons tightened as the routine repeated. A new skill from one immediately became a challenge for the other, and the gap between them became the focus. In that kind of setup, the home stopped protecting the child from pressure because every moment carried a score. The more Kellogg wrote, the more the experiment demanded consistency, and the more consistency demanded control. The study moved forward on a simple idea. Sameness in treatment would reveal difference in nature. The first weeks produced numbers Kellogg did not expect. On several of his simple tests, Gua responded faster than Donald. She followed cues, solved little problems, and adjusted to routines with an ease that looked, on paper, like a lead. Donald, still very young, often stalled or lost interest. The result flipped the assumption of the whole setup. The chimp was not trailing. For now, she looked ahead. Kellogg treated that lead like a challenge. If the chimp could match a human baby, then the next step was to push harder and measure more. He increased the comparisons, tightening the schedule and multiplying the tasks. Every day created new chances to rank them. Who copied a motion first, who obeyed a signal, who showed fear, who showed curiosity. He did not describe it as two children growing up. He turned it into a contest. And once it became a contest, the meaning of each small moment changed. A quick response from Guar became evidence that training and environment might overpower species. A delay from Donald became a warning that the human advantage was not guaranteed. Kellogg leaned into that tension, writing and testing as if the next result could declare a winner. The study stopped being about similarity. It became a race, and the stakes kept rising. Week by week, the balance shifted. At first, the hope stayed simple. A chimp raised like a child might act more human. But as Donald watched Guar, he started copying what worked for her. He echoed her quick sounds, tried her sharp little calls, and repeated them because they got attention and results. The experiment stopped being a one-way lesson. It turned into a two-way influence. It showed up in his body, not just his voice. Donald reached and moved the way Guar did, using the same restless gestures and the same bursts of excitement. When she made a sound, he answered with something similar. When she signaled, he tried the signal too. The closer they lived, the more natural it became. Kellogg kept measuring and recording, but the direction of change looked wrong. This was the turning point that nobody planned for. Instead of Guar crossing toward human behavior, Donald drifted toward hers. Each imitation mattered because it happened during the months when a child normally built the basics of speech and social habits. And once those patterns settled in, they did not just disappear the next day. The study still looked orderly on paper. In real life, it began to tilt toward harm. Kellogg watched the imitation spread past cute sounds and simple copying. Donald did not just echo Guar's noises, he leaned on them. The longer the routine continued, the less Donald reached for clear human words. Milestones that should have appeared started arriving late or not at all. What looked like a brief mimic stage began to look like a new default, and that meant the experiment was no longer neutral. Donald's behavior shifted in ways that were harder to dismiss. When he wanted something, he relied more on gestures, cries, and quick bursts of sound, the same kinds of signals that worked for Guar. Instead of pushing towards speech, he seemed to meet her where she was. The comparison that once felt like a race now felt like a pull. The wrong subject was changing, and Kellogg could measure it. The promise of the study had been observation, not damage, but the data now carried a warning. Close contact did not just shape habits, it shaped development. Kellogg faced a problem he could not correct with more testing. Every day, the pair stayed together, the pattern deepened, and Donald's language lag became harder to explain away. Curiosity turned into alarm. The project stopped being scientific daring and started looking reckless. By the time Kellogg admitted the study had become dangerous, there was no clean way to stop it. Everything had been built around the idea that the two infants belonged together day after day, as if that closeness was harmless. Then, in 1932, he ended it fast. The tests stopped, the shared routines stopped, and the big decision landed all at once. Guar had to leave. He arranged to send her away, pulling her out of the only home she had known since infancy. The separation did not just remove an animal from a household. It cut a bond the adults had encouraged on purpose. Donald lost the constant companion he had been trained to mirror. Guar lost the human family she had been taught to rely on. The experiment ended, but the consequences stayed. Inside Kellogg's own home, the fallout became personal and immediate. Donald still carried the habits he had picked up, and his development did not reset just because the project ended. The family had to face what the records could not fix: confusion, distress, and a child who had been steered off course during the months that mattered. Kellogg closed the study, but he did not close the damage. After the separation, the paper trail went thin. The daily notes stopped, the measurements ended, and the experiment that had produced so much data suddenly produced silence. But stories did not stop. In the months that followed, reports surfaced that Gua did not adjust well to being removed from the only home she had known. Her condition reportedly worsened, and the upbeat tone that once surrounded the project began to crack. People described Gua as declining, not in some abstract way, but in the plain sense of getting weaker and failing to recover. Whatever the exact cause, the outcome landed hard. She reportedly died while still young. That single fact changed how the whole study sounded when it was mentioned afterward. It no longer read like an odd family science project with uncomfortable lessons. It read like an experiment that ended with a life cut short. And once death entered the record, the story carried a different weight. The separation was no longer just a decision made to protect a child's development. It became the moment that seemed to trigger the steepest cost for the animal placed into that human world. The legacy shifted in hindsight from an unusual comparison between species to something darker. The study had not only reshaped behavior, it had left damage behind. In the years that followed, the study stopped being treated like a daring look into human nature and started showing up as a warning. Researchers cited it when they needed an example of what happened when curiosity ran ahead of caution. The facts stayed the same, but the meaning changed. What once sounded like innovation looked, in hindsight, like a boundary crossed in plain sight. The sharpest criticism focused on the way the project mixed science with family life. A child was not a volunteer in any real sense, and the decision to turn a home into a testing ground left no space for independent consent. The lines between parent and experimenter blurred. That mattered because the person in charge of protecting the child also chased results. That conflict never went away. Then there was the chimpanzee. Critics argued she was treated less like a living being with needs and more like a tool meant to answer a question. Modern standards demanded oversight, limits, and a clear plan for welfare during and after a study. None of that existed in the same way then. By the time ethics rules tightened, this case had already become a citation people used to say, "Never again." By the time the public looked back, the experiment no longer sounded like a clever test of nature versus nurture. It sounded like a warning. The notes and charts existed, but the results never delivered a clean answer about what made humans human. Instead, the project exposed something else: how far a researcher went when he believed data mattered more than the lives producing it. In 1932, the guiding idea seemed simple and optimistic. If two young beings shared the same meals, routines, and attention, the differences between them might finally become clear. But the home did not behave like a controlled space. Feelings, attachment, and imitation pushed back. The closer the pair lived, the harder it became to separate science from parenting and observation from responsibility. So the study survived in history not as a breakthrough, but as a lesson in limits. It showed that ambition could outrun judgment even in an ordinary household. The cost did not stay inside the notebooks. It spread into development, into welfare, and into grief. The hopeful belief that a family setting could absorb experimentation without damage did not hold. The consequences remained the main evidence.